So that's right. Let the hate train commence. Let America rejoice. The GT6 is getting a V8. We've got a lot to cover in this episode, so have a seat and let's start by addressing the situation. First of all, things are about to get a whole lot more technical, as although repairing old sheet metal has had its merits, what we're about to dive into has a heck of a lot more going on. Secondly, modifying a car is a very personal experience, and no matter how you go about it, you're bound to have a few naysayers. At the end of the day though, it's your car, and you're the only one who needs to enjoy it, so follow your dream. We've called this series a Restomod since the beginning, and we explained a few reasons for our engine type choice last time, so we're not going to waste a lot of time on that today. I think the best point that we failed to mention though is that neither of us have ever owned a V8, and we want one. True, we could have sold the car and bought something better suited to the swap, but we've grown pretty attached to the little thing over the last 6 years, and let's not forget that it was quickly returning to the Earth and wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the time and TLC we've put into it. While stuffing a big engine into a small car is classic hot rodding at its finest, we're not aiming for something that'll slap you in the face with its craziness. We want a poor man's Jag F-Type, keeping in mind the GT6 has always been regarded as the poor man's E-Type. So we're just aiming for something more modern and powerful, but still simple, understated, and elegant. It should be obvious, but although the original drivetrain in the GT6 worked fine together as a package, in an effort to modernize the car, handle additional power of a V8, and ensure we only have to do things once, we are going to have to make a few other tiny little changes. A stronger transmission is an obvious starting point. We'll also need a better differential and a solution to the Rotoflex joints. The wheel studs on these cars are known to snap, and I guess it would be wise to think about better brakes and tires. The suspension will need some adjustable components, and of course, a bigger engine will need a better cooling system. Some new wiring is also in order, as we don't really trust Lucas. And finally, it would be nice to accomplish all of this while spending as little as possible, because regardless of what over-dramatized, endless budget builds you've seen elsewhere, this is real life, and we have to be careful with our use of cash. Admittedly, this is sounding like a lot of work, and I'm sure most of you are expecting us to cut to a clip of a donor car pulling up our driveway now, as that would obviously be the best route to take. If you haven't noticed yet though, we've only got a single car garage, so whatever donor we did buy would have to remain outside. We also try to keep our house looking somewhat respectable, and having a dirty old car sitting out there for months, and we know ourselves it would be months, well, that's just out of the question. So although it's not the most ideal path, we're going to source all our new major components from different vehicles and then modify them to work well together. This approach can easily nickel and dime you to death before you can even say credit fraud though, so some careful selections will be in order. We're not building this car for use on the track. It's going to be a road car, and a Grand Tourer at that. So going overkill for no good reason is just a waste on all accounts. Ultimately, we want to use well-made and lightweight components that nobody else wants. Let's be honest, the holy grail of parts hunting. The engine defines the power level and therefore strength requirements, so deciding on that first will help guide us towards the rest of the parts we'll need. There are obviously many different V8 options available, ranging from cheap and cheerful to downright eye-watering values. There's also turnkey reliable and slightly less so options. Everyone instantly thinks of an LS these days, and they're great, but they've been covered so much that I'm sure you'd kill us if we went down that road. So looking elsewhere, there are Ford, Chevy, and Chrysler small and big blocks, Ford Modulars, Hemis, Magnums, and Coyotes. An Audi, BMW, or Mercedes unit could be an interesting challenge, and the 1UZ FE is a particularly good option from the JDM mothership. Countless others could be considered, but they all seem to come up short on being proper enough for this British motor car. So after a lot of hunting and no small amount of effort, we found this, a Rover V8. I thought we decided we were going to get a Rover V8. No, it's not. It's the one I can't mention the name of. Well, the records were wrong. Can't we just take it back? What? So, yeah, it's an LS.
What?
Before you do anything you'll regret, it's not as bad as it seems. Remember your parents always told you not to judge an engine by its cover? Or something to that effect? Take a little closer look. A little closer. Okay, that's a little too close. There. Okay, maybe it's not that obvious. This is an LS4.
4? What are you, idiot?
Oh, steady on! I get that with no further explanations, you probably agree with that guy. But contrary to popular belief at this moment, we're not actually idiots for choosing this version.
Yeah, right. Regardless of the model, why even bother going down the LS road in the first place? People are gonna...
Listen, I know you're upset and busy sharpening your gardening implements, but could you give me a second here to explain? Because there's method to the madness. Thank you. We'll talk specifically about the LS4 a little bit later, but this all started a couple of years ago when I came across a lovely Rover V8 powered GT6 on YouTube, and it got us to thinking, and dreaming, and drooling. We decided we'd like to do something similar, but there was a problem. Rover acquired the rights to the little V8 back in 1965 from Buick, and to this day it is extremely common in England, having been used in many different configurations all the way up to 2004. It's earned a rightful title as England's small block, but the problem we face is they're just not common over here, the same way an LS isn't common over there. Regardless of its rarity though, a Rover 3500 was still the obvious route to take if we wanted to stay with a British engine. But older ones only made about 150 horsepower, and by the time we track down an engine, and then spend more time and money investing in better heads, cam, and intake, and everything else necessary to make some more ponies, we're gonna be in pretty deep. Ultimately, if you chuck enough money at one, you can make 300 horsepower, but an LS makes that in its sleep, and we won't have to order parts from across the Atlantic every time we need something. I'll agree that LS swaps have become about as common online as cat photos, but the reasons why are hard to ignore. They're cheap, abundant, powerful, and have perhaps the best parts and resource support of any engine ever made. Most relevant to us, though, is that they are also very small. Even smaller and lighter than a Rover V8, believe it or not. That's a point that needs coming back to, but for now, just know that that's a huge deal for us. If you remember rule number 1 from the last episode, we refused to alter any external bodywork on this car just to make the new parts fit. The issue with that is making something fit is easier said than done. It may look like the engine bay on these cars is massive, and relatively speaking it is long, but what it really lacks is height and width. And it's really not as long as it looks. Of the myriad of other Spitfires and GT6s that have been swapped to V8s over the years, most of the time they have a hole cut in the hood to clear the carburetor and air filter. Now, coupled with a body lift, low height intake, and tight headers, a Rover V8 can be persuaded to fit. But an LS has a plastic intake manifold with the inlet path coming from the front rather than the top or the side, so we have an even better chance of making it fit. In fact, I know it'll fit because, unfortunately, we're not the very first to try this. I found a guy who managed to fit an LS1 into his GT6, but would be making quite a few changes from the direction that he took. And frankly, as amateurs at this, we're just happy to know that it's gonna fit ahead of time. Thanks to a few unique features, the LS4 is smaller than any of the other models in the family. So small that I've made up a chart to help give reference. As a Canadian, we tend to use metric and freedom units, but we don't like to offend, so I've put in both. These numbers were painstakingly gathered from various sources online, but as such, some may or may not include accessory drives and intakes. Some numbers may also be off by a bit as I have no way to confirm them, but I've made notes where I could, and on the whole, I think you get the idea. Something hard to grasp from just dimensions is that engines are rarely big boxes. They have cutaways and protrusions that affect the overall size. Our factory-fitted inline 6 is noted at the top here, and even though it was a cam and block motor with about the smallest head and valve cover possible, it still came within a centimeter of hitting the hood. Frankly, the clamp on the top water hose has been known to make contact on these cars. When you compare the two, you can see how the LS is actually shorter in length and awfully close otherwise to the Triumph mill. Due to the shape of the hood, as the leading edge of the engine moves back, we also gain more height to work with, so we're expecting to actually have gained hood clearance. The other thing to note here are the weights. Again, it was hard to tell if these all were apples to apples with full accessories and manifolds, but regardless, it still helps tell the story. The Mark III GT6 weighs in just over 2,000 pounds and has a 56-44 weight distribution. If you move the engine back about 9 inches, you can correct this to 50-50, but it's not an insignificant alteration in itself. By running a compact, all-aluminum V8 that's lighter than the old cast iron 6 and connecting it to a slightly heavier but stronger transmission, we'll have brought down the center of gravity and back the weight bias by quite a bit. We don't have any exact numbers, but we're expecting it to be noticeable. And just to be clear, we're talking about a 300% power increase. And considering that the weight should remain pretty close to factory, that's also a 300% power to weight ratio increase. And if that's not enough to get you excited, I don't know what will. It's not going to be the most insane car ever built, but with 6.5 pounds per horsepower, it's going to be on par with some pretty entertaining vehicles. Do a quick search after this video to see what I'm on about. For those of you starting to worry that perhaps this is too much power for this little car, bless your cotton socks, but don't worry, we're taking steps to make sure we control the beast. So hopefully that helps explain why, in spite of everything and everyone against it, we still chose an LS. Haters gonna hate, but we're excited. And hopefully the next episodes will get those who aren't quite feeling it on board as well. But why an LS4? Well, first of all, have you even heard of it? Most of the time it's shunned, unduly in my opinion. We got ours from a local wrecking yard who pulled it out of a 2006 Pontiac Grand Prix GXP, and it's in pretty good shape considering it's a teenaged Canadian motor. The LS4 is an oddball crossover of Gen 3 and 4 parts. It's all aluminum and has the 243 heads. It's got flat top pistons which bump the compression up to 10:1, as well as Gen 4 rods and fully floating pins which make rebuilds easier. It's got the shortest intake manifold ever fitted to an LS, coming in nearly 2 inches shy of the next smallest option. And it's relatively cheap. Around here, if you can find one, an LS1 long block with intake and exhaust manifolds and roughly 200,000 kilometers is going to set you back about 3,000 Canadian bucks. That's over 4.5 years of daily small Timmy's coffees. Some of you will obviously find better deals than this, but this is what I'm finding. We spent less than a third of that, including tax, and a core charge at our local auto wrecker. Why so cheap, you ask? Well, to be brutally honest, there are a few drawbacks. Firstly, being a Gen 3-4 crossover, it's got some odd wiring. The knock sensors are on the side of the block, cam position sensor in the front, and it has a drive-by-wire throttle body, all like a Gen 4. But it still uses the 24X 1X reluctors like a Gen 3. Its fantastic low-profile intake manifold, which helps make this whole swap possible, is also the worst flowing one ever fitted to an LS. Though, keep in mind, it still supports the factory-rated 303 horsepower, which we're not complaining about. It also has a different accessory drive, which was optimized for compactness in the transverse front-wheel drive layout it came out of, but sadly won't work so well in the rear-wheel drive longitudinal platform we're putting it into. It also uses a different transmission bolt pattern. And it doesn't have a starter mount. To be honest, those last two are the real reasons why this engine's so cheap. Nobody wants it, but that's exactly what we're looking for. We're going to take these deterrents and use them to our advantage. In the entire history of the GM small block family, dating from the present back to the 50s, they've all used largely the same bell housing bolt pattern known as the 90-degree pattern. This is the main reason why the small block is among, if not the most swapped engine ever. The LS4, however, uses the GM V6 bolt pattern known as the 60-degree or metric pattern. It's completely different. This is important. It means you can't just simply bolt on any transmission from any other small block setup. An automatic could be fairly easy to sort out, as there are rear-wheel drive V6 options. But keep in mind Rule 2 from last time, we're only interested in the manual. The whole setup will not be normal, but by far the hardest to figure out will be the flywheel and starter, as there's literally nothing off the shelf that'll work for us. A normal LS flywheel will be too large to fit in a 60-degree bell housing, and any V6 flywheel will not match the LS crank bolt pattern. A normal LS starter will only engage with a 1/68 tooth ring gear, but seeing as we don't even have a mount for one, we're gonna have to figure out something there too. Most sensible people with a brain in their head will walk away right here. Anything can be solved with enough planning though. The next major item on the agenda for today is the transmission. There's usually a few go-tos in the LS world, but since we're not aiming for insane horsepower out of our engine, we can open up our search a bit. After a lot of looking around, we decided on a Tremec T5, older models known as the Borg-Warner T5. These things have been used in hot rodding for decades, and like with the LS, have an amazing parts and resource support chain. Being a 5-speed, they're pretty light at only 75 pounds, and are known to handle 400 horsepower in a Mustang if driven with feet made of flesh, so it should be more than adequate in a car that weighs over 1,000 pounds less. Torque will destroy them, if not least annoy them, but I digress, let's get back to the rest. Ours is from a 2004 Mustang with a 3.8-liter V6. Again, going for oddball here. The These have all the latest and best components of the T5s, including the carbon fiber synchro rings and world-class style bearings, giving them the second highest power rating of all T5s, and yet can still be found in the junkyard today. Unlike all of the older world-class units out of Fox bodies that are getting harder to find. Not to mention, being out of a V6, they should have seen an easier life. It has a 0.68 overdrive ratio, meaning that even though we have 23-inch tires, we should hopefully still be able to keep our revs pretty low on the highway. Lastly, it also has an electronic speedo sending unit, which should work well with their planned wiring system. We picked up a really nice one for about 1/10 of what a T56 would have cost to adapt. But, of course, there is a catch. Firstly, we're mating Ford to Chevy, and secondly, it has the longest input shaft of any T5 ever made, which will potentially lead into some fitment issues later on. The main reason for going with a Ford T5 though, is there's actually a couple of bell housings available that'll mate it up directly to our LS4. We went with this aluminum bell housing from a 1983 to 86 Jeep CJ with the AMC 2.5 liter inline 4-cylinder engine, not to be confused with the Iron Duke engine. Got that? Some of you may already know this, but AMC like to part share, and as a result, they ended up using an engine with a 60-degree GM bolt pattern and a T4-T5 Ford-style transmission bolt pattern, which necessitated a bell housing to adapt them. The main bore size here is important as it keeps the engine and transmission concentric, or in line. Oddly, the bell housing diameter here is just a hair smaller than our transmission's input shaft retainer, but a few quick passes in a lathe by a friend of ours gets it to a point where it all bolts right up. What this means is that although we'll have to come back to sort out the clutch, flywheel, pilot bearing, throwout bearing, and starter motor later, we can at least bolt the main parts together for now to get the overall shape. As a note from the future, we've just about sorted out the last of the needed components here, and it's working out pretty nicely, so we'll have no rude comments saying it's impossible. The last comment I'd like to make about using a 60-degree bell housing is that it's substantially smaller than a 90-degree one. This means we're going to have to hack away less of our car to make it fit, and we should still have pretty decent foot room for a GT6. So that takes care of some major steps. It was a lot of research and planning, but with the parts in our hands, we can now push on to the next step of business, which is some automotive archaeology. The local wrecker we got the engine from had a 30-day warranty on it, which was a nice gesture. But seeing as we couldn't actually fire it up, we opted to tear into it to see what we got ourselves in for. On the whole, everything looks really, really nice. And one of the things we've been very impressed by with this engine architecture is how beautifully simple and thought out everything is. Other than a small dab of RTV to help seal the corners of the oil pan, everything else has lovely captured rubber gaskets and seals. Everything can be taken apart with basic hand tools, even normal 6-point sockets, and I've never pulled a camshaft before, but with the water pump bolt technique, it was frankly a breeze. For the valve springs, we made a tool. I've seen a similar design available online for a few $100, but a small C-clamp and a bit of 1/8 bar stock got the job done and allowed us to pull 2 valves at a time. One of the manifold studs had snapped off, which is pretty typical, but since the heads are aluminum, it's also not a big deal to get it out. The weld on a nut technique works very well, but the trick is to get a few good seconds of build-up on the stud before placing the nut on top. This helps the weld have a fighting chance of penetrating the stud and will make tearing the nut off less likely. We'll clean everything fully, put in new bearings throughout, a light hone and new rings, and do a few preventative mods, but that will all come much later. And in the meantime, we're going to leave all the guts stored away carefully, as it'll make handling the engine a lot easier with about half the weight now missing.
So that's great! We're off to a good start and just need to pull out all the old bits so we can start to mount the new ones in. Right? No? Right. We're gonna have to look at that chassis.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see our videos a day before they come to YouTube, check us out on Patreon. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and share this series with a friend. We'll see you next time.